questions?
Dr. Sheldrake, you talked about flux and bursts and the coordination and shaping their movements. I wondered if you could talk about or aware of any work you've done on this sort of thing playing out in mass psychology with regards to financial markets. In financial markets.
Oh, yes.
Similar to the group mind.
Yes, I mean, interesting, isn't it? We have group mind phenomena, and the financial markets are obviously one place where this works. But I'm not aware of anyone doing studies on it. And of course, people in the financial markets don't usually like to think of themselves as being influenced by a kind of group field. They like to think they're being very smart, making decisions. But obviously, the markets, bull and bear markets and things, are a collective phenomenon, and they go up and down in a way that seems to bear very little relation to the real world. So I think something of that kind is at work in collective human phenomena. But I don't know anyone studying it. And I've never tried to study it myself, so I've never tried to think of experiments. I mean, right now, just since you mentioned it, I could think of one. Take somebody from the financial world, put them in an isolated place where they can't read newspapers, see television, look at the internet, and ask them each day to guess whether they think the markets have gone up or gone down. And it may be that if they're sufficiently tuned in, they might actually be able to feel that movement of the markets. So I think one probably could do experiments on it, but until this moment I hadn't thought of one. And all one needs is a few bankers with nothing better to do. Well, there'll soon be quite a lot, I think.
Next question.
Many thanks for your talk, Dr. Sheldrake. In terms of quantum mechanics and entanglement, we're starting to see the first evidence of biological systems that everybody agrees has some quantum mechanical components. So in chlorophyll and magnetism with birds and such like, smell perhaps with humans. And there's Roger Penrose's idea about the brain being a quantum computer. What would you say about the nature of our relation to this kind of morphic field, fundamental construct, whatever you want to say?
Well, I think that these recent phenomena, like discovering quantum entanglement in the bacterial photosynthetic complexes, where they extend over quite large molecular complexes, is moving us forward to recognizing that quantum effects are happening at a much larger scale than people used to think. But I myself think that morphic fields are like quantum fields, but I don't try and explain them in terms of quantum physics as we know it, because that's based on the quantum physics of very small things like electrons. And I don't want a reductionist approach where we reduce everything to the quantum properties of electrons. But I think the fields of electrons, the quantum fields, are similar in kind to the fields of systems at all different levels of organization, which involve connections, fields of probability, and non-local effects. So I think I see the quantum physics as providing analogies, and in some cases, like in these maybe microtubules that Penrose is interested in, or the bacterial photosynthetic complex, actual quantum processes in molecular complexes. But as I say, I think that when we move up to the level of whole minds or whole organisms, we've got something like quantum fields, but at a higher level of organization.
Next question.
Dr. Sheldrake, you say that telepathy is instant. I don't know if that can be proved or not, but if it is instant, does that mean that there is something faster than the speed of light?
Well, I shouldn't perhaps have said instant we can't do any telepathy experiments with sort of microsecond precision. So I wouldn't like to say it's faster than the speed of light. I mean, it might be. Quantum entanglement is instant, and that, in a sense, is faster than the speed of light. But then people say, well, you can't really send a message because no message can go faster than light, but you can certainly infer what's happened somewhere else from quantum entanglement. I mean, this becomes, in terms of what happens in the Earth, the speed of light is so fast that it would make no difference. It only becomes important if one's trying to think about telepathic communication across, say, galactic distances. And obviously, to speculate about intergalactic telepathy is going way beyond established science. Nevertheless, I personally am very interested in it. And if you think of it like the speed of light, if you wanted to send a message to the other side of our galaxy by radio signals, like in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, they broadcast decimal places of pi or prime numbers in the assumption that other civilizations will have the same kind of maths. Our galaxy is 100,000 light years across, so say you sent a message by radio, the speed of light, with all these things, they respond, realizing, good heavens, there's people out there who know the prime numbers, let's send another lot back. It would take 100,000 years for the message to come back, even if they replied by return. So there would be 200,000 years. So the speed of light becomes enormously cumbersome and lengthy if one's trying to think about any possible kinds of cosmic communication, even within our own galaxy. Then the question of, could telepathy work faster becomes really relevant. But on Earth, I think it makes so little, it's so fast. And when you speak to someone on the telephone in Australia, you don't have a lengthy pause between sentences. It's almost instant because the speed is so fast that it doesn't make any difference on Earth.
Although you get this satellite communication, I noticed on the news, there are 2 or 3 seconds delay.
Yes, there because it's got to go really quite large distances.
Okay, next question.
And this is for the professor. You relate the telepathy and the sort of perceiving people staring to out-of-body consciousness or something like that. Have there been any experiments to try and maybe localize it to the brain, so imaging while doing these activities, or maybe try and localize it to the left or right brain, or anything like that?
No, there haven't yet been any brain scanning studies on these phenomena. There have been experiments where people have done telepathic experiences with electroencephalographs. I haven't done those, but other people working in this field have. They have people who are closely related or bonded in separate places. They measure the electroencephalograph, the electrical patterns in the brain. And then one of the people is suddenly exposed to a sudden flash of light or a sudden loud noise. And that, of course, changes the pattern in the brain. And the other person shows a similar spike or change in their brain far away, in a way that seems to be a kind of physiological telepathy. That's the only experiment I can think of where people have directly looked at brains.
Next question, the lady over there.
When you talk about the kind of group mind of flocks of birds or shoals of fish, can you relate that to a human group mind, such as Carl Jung's concept of collective consciousness and archetypes? And maybe like movements like in Nazi Germany, that kind of thing.
Well, yes, the point about the flock of birds is they're all present at the same time, interacting. Now, the group mind wouldn't necessarily depend on immediate physical proximity. I think that, I didn't talk this evening about my theory of morphic resonance. I think that morphic fields, the fields of social groups or the fields that shape developing organisms, have a kind of memory. Each individual draws upon and contributes to a collective memory of the species. Now that's very similar to what Jung said about the collective unconscious. And I think that when he said that, he was thinking only about humans, but I think that this is a basic principle that applies to all species, and not just animals and plants, but also crystals. Crystals draw on a kind of collective memory. One of the things about morphic resonance in the realm of crystals is that if you make new crystals that have never existed before, and you make them in one place, it makes it easier for that compound to crystallize all over the world by a kind of resonant influence from the first crystals. If you train rats to learn a new trick in one place, rats all over the world learn it quicker because the rats have learned it here. I give the evidence and references in my book, A New Science of Life, and in more detail in the presence of the past, where I show that this, how this applies to human collective memory and relates to Jung.
Next question, lady in the back.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed your talk. I'm sure that my dog knows when I'm coming home. I'll be convinced when it's got my dinner ready as well tonight. I wanted to ask about this resonance between, say, people or animals, what the nature of it is. Alan Shaw, who's a psychoanalyst who's interested in the study of neuroscience, talks about us being neurobiologically attached, so that if, for example, we lose someone, it feels like we've lost a part of ourselves, say a limb. What would you say in terms of morphic fields? What is the nature? It's not our nervous systems that are attuned. What is it that we're communicating through this extended mind?
Well, what's attuned is the vibratory patterns of activity, and of course our nervous systems are vibratory patterns of activity. Everything in nature, including atoms and electrons, are vibratory patterns of activity. Morphic resonance says that similar vibratory patterns of activity resonate with other similar ones. They're linked together in fields, so the whole is more than the sum of the parts, and when you have a bond with a person or an animal that you're attached to and is attached to you, then you're linked through a field and you're connected through that field. If the animal dies or if the person dies, then it affects the field straight away. And some of the most dramatic kinds of telepathy are where, with dogs, I've got more than 100 cases on my database where dogs start howling for no apparent reason, and it later turns out their owner's had an accident or has died at that moment somewhere else. That the field is immediately changed, whether at the speed of light or not, is immediately changed by the loss or the death of one of the people or animals within it. So I think that creates, as it were, a kind of space in the field. It affects the whole pattern of relationship. So I don't think these things are actually inside brains. I think that the brain and the patterns of activity of the brain are one of the things that resonate with these fields.
Next question, lady.
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. It's I've experienced myself that telepathy seems to be horizontal, you know, when like it's somehow related to the sixth sense. But when I meditate, I seem to go vertical, you know, I seem to go to the higher conscious, and it seems to have something with the seventh sense, which is
Yes.
but not physical or materialistic. It's something else.
Yes.
I find myself somewhere else that it's not physical. So I don't know what the question is there, but just.
Well, I think it's the difference between telepathy, I think, as you say, is kind of horizontal. It links us to other people or animals to which we're bonded. Mm-hmm. It's what, in general terms, would be called a psychic power. It's a power of the soul. And the soul, the word soul causes terrible confusion because it's changed its meaning in the West as a result of Western science. But in medieval theology, in Christian theology in the Middle Ages, there was a distinction between the soul and the spirit. And the spirit was that which connected us to the creative power of God. And God was in the realm of spirit. But the soul was part of our natural being and linked us to other people. It was part of the help shape our body, underlying the health of the body. Rather practical things to do with links with others and so forth. And would be more concerned with what you call the horizontal level, whereas the spirit would be more to do with the vertical level. But people define these words differently, and then as soon as you move to France, they have different words again. They don't use them in the same sense, and then the Germans use them differently. So there's a terrible confusion about exactly how we use words. it reflects the fact our civilization is completely at a loss, really, to deal with these things to do with the mind, and because you can't really translate them into the language of mechanistic science. But one of the things that is key to this is that in the older understanding of the soul in ancient Greece, Aristotle, and in medieval philosophy, the soul was the form of the body, so the soul shapes animals and plants. All animals and plants have souls. The vegetative soul of plants shapes the form of the plant, it gives it its pattern and form. The animal soul of the animal, in addition to the vegetative soul that shapes the animal, gives it its instincts, enables it to coordinate sensations and movements. And in humans, in addition to the vegetative soul that shapes our body, the animal soul that gives us our animal nature, there's the rational soul that gives us thought, language, and consciousness. Basically, what happened in the 17th century with the mechanistic scientific revolution is that the animal and the vegetative souls were abolished, making animals and plants machines. The whole of nature became inanimate and mechanical, leaving only the human rational mind, free-floating with no bridge between that and the mechanical body. And we've had that dualism ever since. It's haunted science and Western philosophy because the middle level, the soul, was eliminated. But magnetic phenomena were explained in terms of magnetic souls up until the 17th century. Then those were abolished too, which made magnetism inexplicable. And then in the 19th century, fields were invented. And fields do more or less what souls used to do. So if you want to translate medieval ideas of the soul into modern science, you have to translate the word soul as field.
Would you say that is in spiritual growth throughout the centuries?
Well, I don't know that it's a spiritual growth. I think there's been a terrible confusion about this. I think that the dynamics of experience in meditation and in spiritual life have remained much the same, but the way we interpret them in terms of existing concepts in the culture around us has been very confused lately because mechanistic science leaves no place for these to relate to the body. In fact, of course they do, and I think thinking in terms of fields makes it easier.
Next question, gentleman.
Dr. Sheldrake, thank you for your talk, very interesting. I wanted to jump back on something you said about crystals. Because yes, we can say that the idea fields apply to animals, maybe to cells, and the idea that it could work on a crystal. But then, so do you think, does it need a carrier? Does the morphic field need a carrier? And can the carrier of the morphic field change? Or can it, does it hold an information that could be different forms? Could you hold information, say the cell, within a crystal, or that type of idea? Or, sometimes, yeah.
Well, I think the fields are patterns of activity that shape developing organisms and shape nervous systems. They're a bit like quantum fields in quantum field theory. And if you ask the question, what are the known fields of physics made of? This is a complicated question. I mean, even if we take the known fields of physics like electricity, magnetism, and so on, in the 19th century, Maxwell thought that they were made of ether, subtle matter, because it was a very materialistic era, and if they existed, they had to be material. So they invented subtle matter for fields to be made of. But in Einstein's theory of relativity in 1905, the special theory, he abolished the concept of ether, and so you're just left with fields. And what are fields? What Faraday said about them and what Einstein took up was that they're modifications of mere space. They're patterns in space. Space itself has a structure, a shape, and the field's made of that. So if you then say, well, what's the field made of, what's the carrier of it, then it would be space. But space can be modified in many different ways. And there are many kinds of fields in science. And attempts to produce unified field theory is currently taking place through superstring theory and M theory. Try to explain them all in terms of a basic fundamental field which has 10 or 11 dimensions. Now, in modern science, extra dimensions come cheap. And I can't conceive what these things do. But if you say even about what are the known fields of physics made out of, they're made up of a superfield with lots of dimensions. So they're made up of space, and fields are made of other fields. Now, it doesn't really help us understand the nature of morphic fields particularly, because we don't understand the regular known fields very well. But morphic resonance, the influence of one pattern of activity on another, I think happens across space and time. That think of a giraffe embryo developing inside a giraffe mother's womb. That embryo is resonating with millions of past giraffes, each one slightly different. And what it gives the field has a kind of probability structure, a kind of average of all previous giraffes. It's not a precisely defined field. And that's very like quantum fields, which are fields of probability. So I think they're fields of probability, and they work by modifying probabilities in the systems under their control. That puts it briefly, but perhaps incomprehensibly. But I try and develop this in detail in my book, A New Science of Life, which is where I put forward this theory in explaining the details.
Next question, lady.
Dr. Azmayesh, you talked about the spider going in a state of voluntary death when in a closed space with patterned air. How do you suggest that human beings like yogis and Sufis you mentioned are able to shut down the brain to enter such a state? And why do you say that this knowledge is attained only when the state of death before death is achieved?
So it is a practical question, because it's about the method that the Sufi and the mystic they are using in order to make an empty channel between the brain and the heart. The heart is the beating muscle in the left side of the chest. It means the heart, the muscle of the heart, is the source of this magnetical field. It is the center of extended mind. It is the center, it is the carrier of the magnetical field and the extended mind and the absolute consciousness. So we would like to re-establish again a connection to the heart and to make an empty channel really between the brain and the heart. So all of the method of mysticism, Gnosticism, Sufism, Buddhism, Hinduism, etc. is how to refine back the connection to the heart, because we are disconnected from our heart. So it is very important what the research of Professor is very, very important, because it is a bridge between science and between ilm and irfan, between science and mysticism. It's very important, because with the research, with all of this research, it is clear that we need scientifically the new paradigms. The old definition of the science is no longer valid to explain a lot of things which is happening around ourselves, and we are careless about them. The Sufism, for example, or mysticism in general, is based on the philokalia. Philokalia. It means to love the beauty under the dust of the matter. How to see, how to see. So, how to dig, how to go inside of the mind, and how to reconnect back to this extended mind out of the brain. The brain is an obstacle. So when the Sufi is connected to his heart, it is the near-death experience. And this is a method, it is a matter of practice. It is not theory. But the theories are going in this sense. It's very important. And when somebody is reconnected back to his heart, to her heart, he can define back the Kaya, the beauty of the Creator through the dust of the matter.
Next question.
Dr. Azmayesh, I think I've heard you saying that you could record activity when the brain was dead in the mind or imagination. How was that measured?
So it means that it is what is said that after death experience, it means that somebody who passed away, that his heart stopped beating and the blood is no longer pumped to the brain and he's no longer alive. And he comes back, it means that his heart restarts to beat again. And from that moment he memorized a lot of things which happened during the time that he was no longer alive. It means that we have a kind of memory which is not material, which has nothing to do with the cells of the brain. That the cells of the brain are the support of this no material memory, but it is the extended mind. Extended mind means not being limited in the border of the brain.
Next question.
Dr. Sheldrake, very much very interesting and entertaining talk. Thank you very much. I'm totally new to morphic field theory, which you're now. That's why there's many questions there. First question would be whether morphic fields are a function of living matter, or they also are characteristics of animated matter. And the second question is whether those fields have source, or they have a beginning, and whether they actually ever end.
Okay, well, I think morphic fields are the organizing fields of self-organizing systems, and that includes animals and plants, but it also includes atoms, molecules, and crystals. So I think that, for example, when a protein molecule folds up to give its three-dimensional form, I think that's being shaped by a morphic field. So that's not a living organism, it's just a molecule. So I think they apply right across the scale of nature. I think they probably also apply to solar systems and galaxies. So I think they apply to all self-organizing systems. I think they're what give them their self-organizing ability. The word morphic means form or shape. They're the fields that shape self-organizing systems and make the whole more than the sum of the parts. Now, their principles, because of morphic resonance, they're basically habits. And the theory I'm putting forward says that the so-called laws of nature are more like habits. There's a kind of memory in all of nature. And everything in nature has a kind of habit. So nature is a great system of habits. In an evolutionary world, obviously there has to be more than habits, because everything would just repeat forever if it was just habit. There's a creative principle as well. And what cosmic evolution and biological evolution and human evolution shows is that there's, as well as habit, a creative principle whereby new forms, new patterns can come into being. If they're successful in terms of natural selection, if they're repeated, the more often they're repeated, then they become new habits. So evolution is an interplay of habit and creativity. Morphic resonance and morphic fields explain the habits, but they don't explain the origin of new ones, where the first life comes from, the first plant, the first animal, the first eagle, the first feather, the first hemoglobin molecule. There has to be a creative principle in nature, and then that's really a question of what philosophy do you have of creativity. Materialists say, well, there is nothing beyond nature, so it's just chance. Some people say the creativity wells up from below, others say it descends from above. These are different metaphors, but creativity is a profound mystery, and yet it happens. So there has to be an origin of these fields. I don't think there's necessarily an end. The dinosaurs had dinosaur fields. And when the dinosaurs became extinct, there were no longer any dinosaurs to tune into those fields. But I think the fields are potentially present. The world, as it were, is haunted by the fields of extinct species. And sometimes they reappear. One form of abnormality that occurs in animals is called atavism, where animals produce forms that belong to extinct ancestors. So I think that the fields are potentially, if something's there to resonate with them, they'll reappear. But the reason we don't have dinosaurs around now is there are no dinosaur eggs to resonate with the fields. Inheritance depends partly on DNA, which gives the ability to make the right proteins. But DNA, I think, is grossly overrated. It doesn't code for everything about an organism, it just codes for its ability to make the right chemicals, the right proteins. Anyway, I can't really give a whole exposition of the whole theory, but that's just sort of in a nutshell some of the things relating to your question.
It's the last question. Okay, last question.
Thank you very much. Dr. Azmayesh, I'd like to ask you, I wonder if you can precise on the methods of the Sufis to reach an extended mind, or if it is just a matter of coincidence to reach there. And second question belonging to that is, what changes in the life of a person who has this experience of die before dying?
So to gain this knowledge, so we must place our mind from our brain to our heart. Replace the mind has nothing to do with the brain. So the center of the attention is the brain, and it is not right. The Sufi and the mystic, they are working on their heart, and they are changing this center. The center of the attention is the heart, and the method is there, just there. It is not complicated, but it needs a lot of serious practice.
I'd like to thank Dr. Sheldrake and Dr. Azmayesh for giving us a presentation. Also, I'd like to thank all of you for attending tonight's presentation. I'd also like to remind everyone that the books speakers are available outside. And we will also be holding another presentation on the topic of consciousness in the future. So if you want to be in touch, make sure we have your email address outside. Thank you very much.